And here is another practice test question brought to you from yours truly. I hope this one is, well, let me just put it this way. This one comes from a very practical place, near and dear to my heart. I have worked through this or fought through this several times, and each time I'm embarrassed to say I eventually figured it out. So I hope this saves you time, and I'm also hoping this is going to save me time, because if I put this into a practice test question, or write it out, record a video about it, well then hopefully this will stick me even more in my brain than it should have been. Well, it should have already stuck in there, but I keep running into this issue. So as a result, let's just jump into this question. Enough of this prologue? No, not a prologue. Prelogue, whatever that is. The setup here for this question. You are scaffolding your local development environment. Everything is working as expected until you get to the checkout, where you see a loading spinner. You track this back to the serialization method, get serialized checkout config. Values are sent to this method, but nothing is returned. So here we go. What is the problem? There was a couple of clues that I put into this text, and I hope that you have taken a few moments as you work through this question, answer yourself, to see what might actually stick out as some interesting clues, especially as we take a look at the answers. Now, let's see what these answers are. A, an exception is thrown due to invalid payment credentials. B, the blank value was cached before the database or the website was loaded. The serializer cannot serialize invalid characters. Okie doke. So let's take now a look each one of these individually and kind of see why or why not this would be a legit option here. So number one, an exception is thrown due to invalid payment credentials. Now, in my experience, and maybe this is limited, but I find that payment credentials are almost exclusively used to they're obviously used in API calls, and API calls are usually used, for example, in authorization or something along those lines. There are a couple instances, for example, with Braintree, where the API can be called when the page is loaded, for example, for a registered user, etc. And I can't remember specifically if that is called, but I know there is that option on the Braintree API side. So this is possible. However, I would be very surprised if this would have the impact of erasing out checkout config. If an uncaught exception is thrown, it most likely will end up cascading out to the entire page. In fact, we can go take a look at the source code here, which we're going to be diving to eventually here. We can see this get checkout config provider get config, and I am not seeing, unless it is caught at the actual, well, if it's not caught, which there is no catching mechanism through this process, it's just going to bubble up and the whole page is going to die. So this, I do not believe, answer A is an answer that would fit in this type of scenario. Even if it was possible, it's not going to cause the page to just see a loading spinner on that, because that means some JavaScript was initialized, some was not, and that's just not going to work. Let's look at option number 2 here. The answer is, so B is the blank value was cached before the database, or actually it should be the website was loaded. So in this case here, with the database or the website being loaded, again, looking in the code here, I don't see anywhere. We can see our HTML file, and we know that the checkout is not cached at all. You couldn't do that. I don't see anywhere that there's actually caching mechanisms being involved. And again, this is where it comes back to your knowledge of the checkout page, understanding exactly what's going on from a number of different vantage points. So this is kind of coming back where this B is answered by the fact that there is no caching that is happening with this. And finally, we have the serializer cannot serialize invalid characters. What's going on here? Well, one thing I wanted to call out is it is best practice to use a different crypt key. So if we come down here into our app etc env.php, it is best practice to use a different crypt key for, oopsie, wrong one, there we go, for production, of course, versus your local environment. Now, if you're pulling back a production database that's hopefully been sanitized, again, this is a big deal to sanitize it, to at least clean out customer information. Very, very important there. And if not, like, payment credentials are a good idea to do that as well. But either way, if that's like your next step on the list, you probably will have encrypted values that were encrypted with the crypt key on the production environment versus a different crypt key on your local environment, which means that your characters will be out of line. So your keys will be out of line. So it means the decryption process will generate some really random gobbledygook, which means the deserializer will not work. So let's come over here, look at our JSON encode here. Pulling this up here. Of course, I have way too many Chrome tabs open per my usual habit here. So we look at the JSON encode, and we see that the return is false on failure. So false will just get rendered out as an empty string. The result here is, yes, we are most likely having to deal with invalid characters. Now, the question is, though, how do we actually fix this? And that can be very difficult, because if we look here at get checkout config, we'll see that there is a lot to work through. And at the end of the day, it just is a matter of walking through each one of these and seeing which one has the offending values. Just plain and simple like that. However, the big key to take away from this is that when we try to serialize invalid characters, so like these weird values that were from the decryption process, using an incorrect decryption key, we get a blank value going into the checkout config. I've run into this a number of times, and actually not just on a local environment. There have been one or two other cases where I have run into this as well. So my goal is that this saves you time. This opens your eyes to how there is some error, how PHP responds to errors, and hopefully this saves you significant time in the future. Thanks for listening to this practice test explainer.